Okay, so this is a quick review of Chapter 5 for Marriage and Family. Okay, so in this chapter, really, we're going to be talking about immigration and how that changes the racial composure or landscape of the United States, and also a gerontological understanding of the changing landscape as well, meaning looking at how demographic changes of people aging in society is affecting things as well. Okay, so when it comes to immigration, immigration again is just the movement of people across political boundaries. So when it comes to immigration, the volume of immigration is relatively large, and new residents are primarily Latino, Asian, and not European as before. When it comes to immigration patterns, immigration's been a major source of population growth and ethnic diversity in the U.S. for a long time, right? We've talked about this already. So the Immigration Act amendments of 1965, which, fun fact, was a executive order, something we've been hearing a lot about lately. It was an executive order by the Johnson administration because before this, immigration was restricted from a lot of countries. There were certain quotas, and basically it limited the amount of people that could come from non-European areas, right? So it was, yeah. It was addressed in 1965 by Johnson, and basically, before that, it would really given the U.S. its own kind of European character, meaning that the majority of people that had been immigrating were people from somewhere in Europe. So nowadays, about 1 million people enter the U.S. legally each year, with another about 500,000 that are unauthorized immigrants who enter and stay. So this is one of those things I know, like you hear a lot about building a wall or this or that, but planes fly over walls. When it comes to undocumented immigrants, a fair share of undocumented population are people that come here for education or work or things like that, and their visas expire and they just don't go home, right? So that's actually a large proportion. And the settlement pattern of new immigration is different from the previous flows into the U.S. that we talked about before, about how they were related to labor, the need for labor, in order to grow crops for the larger industrial cities that were growing. The need for people to work in factories, the need for people to work on the railroads, all those kind of things we talked about before. So when it comes to immigration and increasing diversity, about a third of the people in the U.S. are African American, Latino, Asian, or Native American. So racial minority populations are increasing faster than the majority population, meaning whatever it is that we call white nowadays, right? As a terminology or as an understanding of a racialized group, it's something that has really changed a lot over time. It used to include Latinos, used to include people from the Middle East, a lot of these things, and you can look back at the census to see how the definition of white has been very different over time. But anyway, when it comes to African Americans, they've lost their position as the most numerous racial minority. And so typically now immigration is accounting for a large portion of this population growth. And of course, these patterns of immigration are changing the racial composition of society as new groups are coming in different numbers, and that's going to affect who's marrying who's having kids, and just the overall racial diversity. So when it comes to structural diversity of immigrant families, most new immigrants do not speak English. So, some new immigrants live with people who have already been in the U.S. for some time to cope with being in the environment. And so, some families immigrate as intact units, while others are transnational families. And transnational families are just those who have members that are living in two different countries, right? Like, so sometimes one family member goes ahead, gets work, establishes a place to live, and then the rest of the family comes over. And sometimes children actually immigrate without their parents, right? Something that we looked at through the film Which Way Home. So they are called parachute children. These are children that typically arrive to pursue educational opportunities that will help them, basically have a better career, which means a better livelihood, which means a better life, right? And chain migration itself is just the process by which families arrive at different times um, through that migratory process. Oftentimes, well, at least traditionally, it was men who would go and seek out employment first. But actually, there's a lot of cultures around the world nowadays where women's domestic labor is in demand. So women are the ones who are going and establishing residence and jobs in some locations, often in Europe, and then bringing over their families. So when it comes to structural diversity of Latino families, there's a great diversity of Latinos. So in 1970, about 1 in 20 Americans were Latino. Now it's about 1 in 6, right? So that's a pretty big jump within that last 40-year period of time. So there's a great diversity within the group of Latinos, but Mexican immigrants are the largest group. And so Mexicans and Puerto Ricans are also the most economically disadvantaged Latino groups, so they tend to get a lot of focus. When it comes to kinship networks, Latino families are thought to have very strong kinship networks. But of course, this is going to depend on the social conditions, right? Obviously, families like to support each other and be there to help each other, but if there's really no economic opportunities, it's very difficult for families to help each other. Also, Latino families are typically viewed as settings of traditional patriarchy because of this concept of what is often termed as machismo. This idea that men should be in charge, there's a very patriarchal hierarchy of men over women, of parents over children, etc. But a lot of research has actually found this to the contrary, that there's considerable variation in family decision making when it comes to the structure of Latino families, and that this is largely more of a overgeneralization or stereotype about the kind of structures, because not only are there variation among Latinos, there can also be differences within a given Latino family as they experience life differently, right? So how a wife experiences the family versus a husband versus a child that's male versus a child that's female, right? They're going to have different ideas or beliefs about what their family structure means. When it comes to Asian Americans now make up more than a third of all legal immigrants into the U.S. So again, this is a very diverse group of individuals from tons of different countries that all kind of get lumped together in what we call these pan-ethnic groups, meaning that if you were to parse out what does Asian American mean, there's several different countries, several different categories of very specific cultures that are different, that have different foods, that have different languages, but we kind of lump everyone all in together. And the same thing with Latinos, right? So, very diverse group from a lot of different places. When it comes to divorces, the number of divorces for Asian Americans are lower than the US average. And when it comes to education, Asian immigrants typically have higher education levels than the national average overall. And there's also this issue of traditional gender inequality that happens to be related to different earning power and education gaps between men and women, which is, largely a problem in the whole society. And their experiences are constructed by social and historical situations, really like all families, right? Their daily interactions with each other in the outside world are going to structure their, understandings. When it comes to effects of immigration on immigrant families, first, there's the issue of ethnic identity. So assimilation is the process by which an ethnic group adopts the culture of the larger society. This is something that as a culture, we almost force people to do, to adopt the language, to adopt the values of the culture so that they can be accepted and become part of the culture. So one indicator of assimilation is typically language, as foreign language speakers, grew in the 90s and 2000s. Slightly less than 1 in 5 people living in America spoke a language other than English at home. So it's still like kind of an overgeneralization that people don't know English when they come to this country. Actually, a lot of people that immigrate do. But again, this idea is that if someone hasn't learned English, that somehow they're trying to not assimilate. But that's really not the case often, especially as the fact that English is not an easy language to learn. It has all sorts of stupid exceptions. So yeah. So typically, new immigrants themselves may be blamed for social problems and resistance to assimilation transformations. So meaning that, you know, if there's poverty or if there's issues of unemployment or things like that, oftentimes immigrant groups will be blamed for those issues, which can, obviously cause a lot of stereotypes or stigma and, resentment and problems for immigrant groups who are, bullied, intimidated, oppressed, and it's often just that people don't see the full picture, the macro structural forces, like racism or the macro structural changes in the economy that have nothing to do with these immigrant groups. Because obviously, when you actually look at it from an economic standpoint, immigrants bring more money into the country than they take out of it, especially because they don't take taxes or any of those things. But really, it's interesting that people will blame immigrant populations, minority populations, the very poor, for the problems that they're suffering from because of those larger macro structural changes, right? So typically when it comes to new immigrants, they have four options when it comes to, what to do when they get to this culture. They can either blend into the US culture as quickly as possible, resist the new ways by being adversarial towards a dominant society, like maybe moving into an enclave or something like that. They could resist the new ways by emphasizing their ethnic ties, deciding not to speak the language or something like that. Or they could move to some bicultural pattern. So these are basically all the kind of ways that immigrants can, or immigrant families can adapt to the pressure to assimilate that people face when they get here. Some more effects on immigration, or effects of immigration on immigrant families. First, there's this idea of, immigration itself. If you can choose to immigrate, right, that is very agentic, meaning that's something where you're taking your own agency as a human individual and deciding to go to another place in order to seek out more opportunities. Of course, there's a lot of people that end up as refugees. These aren't people that actually are choosing to migrate. These are people that would love to stay in their own country, but because of wars, because of catastrophes, because of whatever it is, they have to leave. That's a little bit different, right? But when it comes to the intentional choice, that really has a lot of agency to it. So typically, new immigrants face hostility from their host country, who may fear them as competitors, especially when it comes to economic competition. So a lot of times, if people are ethnically or racially different, they're going to be stigmatized, ghettoized, like given, very little pay, very little status jobs. And so commonly migrants will move to an area of the country where they already have friends or relatives to cope with the new way of life, right? To deal with the stigma, the difficulties, the fact that even if you pick up from anywhere and move anywhere, there's going to be difficulties, right? So having some stability to lean on can really help people settle. So when it comes to effects of immigration on family dynamics, to become a naturalized citizen, usually an immigrant needs a sponsor. So if you have family members already are citizens, are dwelling in the US, then you might immigrate to those same areas so that that person can be your sponsor or help you through the process of naturalization. So again, this is kind of going back to what we talked about a minute ago called chain migration, where one family member is moving first and then they're followed later by the rest of the family. So family members who have assimilated may feel distant from their family, especially when the remainder of the family first migrates. This is especially true in the case where children immigrate first, because children tend to adapt more quickly, right, to a new culture. So they may already be used to life in the US when other family members are not, and they have to catch them up, and that can be kind of frustrating and make family members who have already gone through the hardships, have already adjusted to the new culture, feel, distant from their family that just arrived. When it comes to gender dynamics, immigrants arrive in their host country carrying with them the traditions, norms, and culture of their homeland. So this might include established patriarchal systems of gender interactions, right? Like, for example, there's this issue that people often talk about. We'll talk about it later in the course, but about FGM, right? What they call female genital mutilation, an issue that happens in some cultures around the world, where women at a very young age, maybe 8, 9, 10 years old, have their clitoris forcibly removed, and skin is removed and sewn together. And so, this is something that in our culture we consider to be obviously oppressive and dangerous, but in other cultural areas, because of the culture, because of the belief system, it's a practice that basically within those cultures, if a woman does not go through it, she's not marriageable. And since in those same cultures, women don't have opportunities to have, a profitable or stable life without marriage. So it's a very culturally important practice. But it's one of those things that people typically think of happening somewhere else. But actually, there's thousands of cases of FGM that happen in the United States every year. Why? Because immigrants come here from cultures where FGM is acceptable, and what was done to them, what was done to their mothers. So they do it to their own children or nieces or whatever, because again, it's considered culturally appropriate to them. So this is something we have to take into account when it comes to immigrant groups, is that they're going to bring their belief systems with them. So this is where that part about assimilation gets a little tricky, right? That this can be kind of a clash between those values that they had brought with them, that they grew up with, and especially if those are very patriarchal systems of gender interactions, that might be more of an acceptance of domestic violence or child abuse or things of that nature. So, that often has a gender dynamic. So if immigrant women go to work outside the home, it can often cause conflicts within the relationship, especially if it's a patriarchal structure where the man is expected to be the breadwinner and kind of control the household. Because how else do you have control in a capitalistic society? You control the money, right? So what happens if you don't control the money? Then you don't control the family structure. That really kind of takes the legs out from that patriarchal model. So, that her working outside the home may reduce the power between men and women, which may even lead to what's called horizontal violence. So this is a sad but common truth, that there's often men who are socially marginalized, because of their situations that they experience in their life, or often they're marginalized by poverty, by their race, and so oftentimes some of these men, especially men from cultures that are very patriarchal, like our own, feel the need to reestablish their power through enacting violence towards those who have less power than him, specifically his wife and children, right? So meaning you go out into life and you're treated like crap by everyone at work, by everyone in life, and you come home and you treat your wife and your child horribly or with violence in order to feel like you have some power, right? So that's a problem of horizontal violence that can often come from a very tilted, unequal patriarchal structure of a family. So when it comes to the new second generation, there were 17.1 million children under the age of 18 living in immigrant families in 2010. So these children account for 22% of children in the US. That's a big chunk. So they're the fastest growing segment of the population. And this generation tends to be fluent in English. And like we'll talk about, that's important. Largely because parents become dependent on their children's English, right? So if children, they come up in the school system, or just the fact that they adapt easier, and when you're a child, your brain takes to language a lot easier. Parents will often become dependent on their kids to translate for them, right? At the store, at wherever they are, at school. And so oftentimes the fact that the child has to translate back and forth, the parent loses their authority in that situation, right? So it's interesting, their authority that would have been stronger if they were able to communicate, if they didn't need to defer to their child for help, But because they have to do that, that kind of causes a little bit of a wedge in that relationship. So, children often in the situation don't see their parents' experiences in the previous country, like in their country that they immigrated from, as relevant to their own experiences in the US. Because they kind of think like, well, sure, that's what your culture did, or that's what, you experienced, but how does that affect me? I don't live in that country, right? So they might start to even view their own ethnic heritage as deficient because, they're still growing up in a culture that, you know, um, denigrates uh, ethnic minorities and immigrant groups, right? So the generation may clash with their parents over traditions such as arranged marriages, right? Things that were commonly accepted in cultures that they emigrated or that they immigrated from. Um, Basically, once someone is socialized with the cultural values of American society, they no longer accept the ideas of their parents' cultural value system. When it comes to elderly immigrants are usually legal immigrants into the US. Typically, they're poor and they don't speak English, and so they're often dependent on family members for support, for housing, and for dealing with the new society. So the dependence of elders on their children works against traditional respect for elders, and as a result, elders often become submissive to their children. When it comes to the aging of society, I put the little graph from your book in here. When it comes to demographics, a falling birth rate and advances in medicine combine to make the 65 and older category the fastest growing segment of the population. When it comes to the growth of the elderly population, it's estimated that by 2030, there will be 8.5 million people age 85 and over, and by 2050, it's expected to reach 19 million. So over here is a graph showing the projections that there will be more elderly people than ever before, right? If you look at what there has been to what there will be. And of course, this is going to change the entire structure of society as we need to fulfill the needs of these elders. When it comes to the consequences of aging society on families and the elderly, first there's the issue of economic resources. So, economic resources are distributed unequally among the elderly, meaning that, women often have less money that are elders than men. Elderly people of color are disproportionately poor, right? So, these things are the consequences or issues of aging are felt differently by different aged demographic populations. When it comes to living arrangements, these vary by age, sex, race, and marital status, meaning that residents of nursing homes are typically over 75, female, white, and widowed, right? So when it comes to a lot of the issues that affect elders have to do with health issues, right? As you age, more health maladies people are going to face. So as a result, in our culture, because we don't have subsidized medical care for all like they do in pretty much every other developed nation, um, paying for healthcare becomes a huge problem for the elderly because they have a very fixed income, limited economic resources, especially if they're women or people of color. This means that, and because of the structure of the medical system itself, the majority of difficulty with Medicare is insufficient funding, which leads elders to pay a considerable share of their medical costs themselves, meaning that, these programs are supposed to cover them, but they get cut more and more politically because of some, conservative this or that ideology. But in effect, the more and more people that are aging into this population, we need to be cognizant that they are going to need support or they literally die, right? And this is horrible for their families who have to deal with these, catastrophic illnesses. And then as soon as their loved one passes away, they have these insane bills to pay, because of that care. So, when it comes to Medicare, this began in 1965. And if you're over 65, you're automatically enrolled, and it comes out of our tax dollars. So the idea is that in, Bernie Sanders' plan that he's put to the floor like a dozen times would be what he calls Medicare for all, meaning expanding the coverage limits of Medicare. I think what they would do is like lower it to, I think it's like 50, and then everyone under like 20 or something like that is covered as well. And then eventually they would expand it into the adult market, people that are often covered by their employers. So this is a very common system they have in other cultures. You are taxed at a higher percentage rate, but because the wealthy are actually taxed fairly at a percentage rate as the same rates as the poor, which seems kind of obvious, there other cultures are, easily able to pay for this kind of system, for everyone, not just for seniors. But in our culture, it's been under attack for the last 40 years through a process of what's called neoconservatism, right? Neocons are often what people are called that favor this policy. But, basically private healthcare industries and, others have basically a problem with this Medicare for All model because it would cut them out of the system and save billions of dollars in the process, right? So instead of our money getting filtered through these companies who then take a share off of it, it would actually be a direct market from your tax dollars to your healthcare provided, right? So not everyone's stoked about that, at least if they make a lot of money off of the current system. So especially for seniors, though, seniors go through a lot of issues where it's called donut holes, meaning that Medicare only covers so much. They have different parts for Medicare now, at Medicare A, B, C, etc. And while they do cover some preventative stuff for certain things because of the Obamacare expansions, such as like my grandmother and, now my parents are both on this as well. And they get to go to like the gym for free, like a free gym membership or things like that, because they know that preventative medicine actually saves money in the future when you don't develop these huge health problems. But ultimately, there's a lot of different provisions and issues where Medicare doesn't cover all the actual medical care that elders need, and so they have to buy these private insurance plans to cover what they call the donut holes in the Medicare coverage, especially when it comes to prescription drug plans. If you're taking a lot of pills, you're going to need some sort of plan to pay for those things, as the cost of pills in the United States are incredible compared to basically everywhere else. Again, because of the power of the pharmaceutical industry itself to set its own prices, and to try to attack generic drugs, so that they aren't able to charge much less prices for the same exact medication. But, elders have had these issues, especially poor elders, where they have to choose between being able to, have enough money to eat or enough money to pay for their prescriptions. And the whole point of Medicare was to make sure that elders were provided for. So this, program itself has been under attack politically for a long time because it's seen as a, quote, handout by some. But on the other hand, it's really others argue it's really a lifeline for millions of elder Americans that need the support in order to continue living. When it comes to role transitions, the elderly in society encounter a number of role transitions, such as retirement. So most people retire between the ages of 60 and 70. And for, some people, retirement's a very difficult stage because they don't feel as useful as they used to. Plus, retirement might mean less income for some elderly people. And again, oftentimes we get our identity from our job. People say, "What do you do?" Right? And that's kind of how they understand who you are in the culture. So going from something that you did every day of your life and then having that gone can really be a loss of identity for a lot of people. Also, there's a role transition from independence to dependence, meaning that, adulthood is a time of financial and social independence from others, right? It's this thing that when you're a kid, you want to be an adult because you want the independence, and then you become an adult, and then you're like, no, bills, work, this sucks. Why did I want to be an adult? So, adulthood is like you make the decisions, you make the plans, you're in charge, right? But towards the end of our lives, when we become elderly, we may need others to help us, right? We might become dependent on our adult children or others just to simply get from place to place. And so this shift can be very difficult for elderly people and for his or her caregivers, who have to deal with the kind of emotional reactions of a person who is not comfortable with going from, living a very independent life to being dependent. Like, for example, my grandmother, 94 years old, still drives. like, I can't believe that's a thing that is allowed. She's had a few car accidents in the last couple of years. It's pretty insane when you think about it. And yeah, I mean, she doesn't drive a lot. Like, we're not talking about she's like Uber driving or something. Like, she's a very limited, like, church and her community volunteering stuff and home and everything. But it's ridiculous, I think, right? But it's because, she's a very independent person. She doesn't want to give that up. She's very healthy, very active. And, 94, geez, it's like she'll say, like, oh, well, I just don't feel as fit as I used to. And I'm kind of like, yeah, that's kind of how that works. I don't either. And I'm not 94, so I can't even imagine. Right? So this can be very difficult for elders and also their caregivers, like such as my parents, that try to reason with her about these things, right? Another role transition is widowhood. So, of course, losing a spouse is a very, difficult issue that affects people's lives. So the probability, of course, of being a widower increases with age because, probability of death increases with age. That kind of makes sense. So, you know, widowhood is a social disruption. It seems to actually be more difficult for men than it is for women, which is a really interesting phenomenon. As men often are affected by being married more so than women, meaning that men will live longer when married, which for women, it's pretty much the same. It's kind of funny. And widows are, um, it's interesting when it comes to, being a male widow or a, female. Well, actually, typically the term widow is, I think, supposed to be female by inherently, and then widower is supposed to be male. Ugh, I don't know. We gender our language in such weird ways. Anyway, a person who has survived their spouse, right? That's all I need to say for that, is a widow. And so typically, women that have been widowed are less stressed and less depressed than men who are widowed. And this might just have to do with older populations had more patriarchal structures of their family life. So typically, women were more responsible for the production of the household, right? Meaning like cooking or doing stuff like that might be more of like a daily thing that you miss. But at the same time, just when it comes to marriage in general, men tend to have more of a positive effect within their lives. They tend to make more money, they tend to live longer, etc. While women, it doesn't really affect them as much. When it comes to living alone, in the early 1900s, 70% of widows and widowers moved in with their families. So basically, back in the early 1900s, almost everyone moved in with their families, right? So you would overwhelmingly, like, only 1/3 of people basically did not move in with their family after they were widowed. But nowadays, that same proportion lives alone, meaning that what was that 30% living alone after being widowed in the 1900 is nowadays in 2010. Well, nowadays is in 2010, but in your the research from your book looks at 2010. From 2010, about 70% of widows live alone now, only 30% of them living with their families. So that's a real big change demographically. And, there's some challenges that come with widowhood, obviously. Loss of a spouse reduces income from Social Security, right? Instead of getting 2 checks, you're getting 1. And you might be relying upon that, too, to pay for a mortgage or something of that nature. If you're living alone, if you have some sort of illness, you're not going to have immediate help, right? That's why people buy, like, the life alert buttons and stuff like that. Often, too, when someone is widowed or just ends up living alone, they're going to have some issues of social isolation, right? Like I was saying about my grandma, how she's always out doing this or that. It's like, that's kind of what keeps her going, because she does live in a, retirement facility thing, with like a bunch of old ladies. Well, actually, they're all like 25 years younger than her, but basically, and they all have like activities and things that they do. So it keeps them from that social isolation, which is a negative impact they can have on your health and your, psychological well-being. Also, another role transition is the idea that, death is coming, right? I mean, technically it's coming for all of us, right? Let's be real. But, just the difference between, in 1900, the average life expectancy was 50 years. Now it's 78 years, right? So that's like a big change, right, in that time period. 28 years from 1900 to 2010. Like, that's pretty incredible. So, of course, if people are on average living almost 30 more years, that's really going to affect the structure of society, how we understand the populations of the elderly, and all of that. So, the problem, though, too, is that the majority of an older person's last years and months, are through a debilitating illness. So often that means that they're going to need the care of family members, meaning hospitalization or placement in a nursing home, which typically occurs only near the very end of life. And that's something that, again, puts a lot of financial, psychological, emotional constraints on families. And of course, on the person themselves who are losing their independence, being moved into a facility, and having to deal with knowing that, this is the end, right? So when it comes to responses by the elderly, of course, there's human agency, right? People still have the ability to push back. So the elderly may become isolated, right? If they don't have enough contact with other people, that can make them lonely. That can really, just cut them off from the rest of the world. And that's, a really sad situation. My mother she delivers Meals on Wheels to people that are, elderly kind of shut-ins, or people that have disabilities and can't get out to get food and these things. And sometimes, she'll be the only person that they talk to, where she'll go in, she'll chat them up, she'll bring them a piece of cake for their birthday, she'll this or that, try and make them feel special, because she knows that even though some of them do have family, they're estranged from them. And that's the only relationship that they have, right? And if they don't have someone to talk to, they can feel very isolated and alone. Also, the elderly may be living on less than enough income, right? A lot of people are on a fixed income. Social Security really doesn't cover very much. And so that can be very difficult to, if you need to make a big purchase, if you need to, just even cover expenses of a medical expense, or, some sort of cost of living increase, that can be very difficult. So, a lot of the elderly have issues about money. So, also researchers argue that the elderly can withdraw from relationships, but the majority of them remain active, so that's a good thing. All right, so the two demographic transformations of society are just the new immigration and aging of society. So those new immigrants coming in since 65 on, and of course, those people living much longer since about 1965 on. So these macro forces have huge consequences for society, communities, families, and individuals, which, we talked about a bit here, but we're going to continue to talk about that and how that happens more recently in future lectures.